To do this, you need to understand the comprehensive assessment system, which is a second aspect of our first learning goal. When you hear the word assessment, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is the high-stakes, year-end summative assessments required by the state. The second thing that comes to your mind is probably something like, there's too much testing. Although people disagree about how many tests students should take, there is agreement that assessment has its purpose, and it does provide information to help and understand where students are. After a year of learning, a student should attain deep learning of the college and career-ready standards for the grade. To help us understand how students are progressing toward college and career readiness, we use a system of assessments that provide data on student achievement. This is the comprehensive assessment system. It is comprised of a variety of assessments, each providing different types of data for different uses. For the purposes of this webinar, we'll briefly describe each type of assessment. But for more information, please refer to the citation found on the bottom of the slide. So starting on the right with end-of-year summative assessments, they provide general information on student achievement for a long period of instruction, typically a year. You are familiar with these tests, especially the ones your state requires students to take in grades 3 through 10. These end-of-year summative tests are used for accountability purposes and show students' relative performance on standards and with other students. The results of these tests often can inform long-term instructional planning, but not the day-to-day planning of instruction for current students in your school. Interim or benchmark assessments are administered periodically, often quarterly, over a school year. Information from these assessments are still pretty general to what students can or cannot do. Results generally are used to support school and district data-based decision-making, such as providing special help to those students identified as struggling, helping predict whether students are likely to test proficient on the end-of-year state tests, and evaluation of programs or interventions. Classroom summative assessments are often given at the end of a unit and used for grading purposes. Although students and teachers can use the results from these tests to provide feedback and identify gaps that need to be filled in, these actions may be a little too late for students and teachers to go back to learn and teach the content again. The three assessment types that we just reviewed are assessment as a product, not as a process. The last two circles on formative assessment refer to assessment as a process. They are separated into two types, in-process formative assessment and formal checks. Formal checks, such as quizzes, class or homework assignments, and presentations, are usually given daily and can help teachers and students to look back at what students have learned. These formal checks are often used to inform instruction for the following day. In-process formative assessment is distinguished from all other types of assessments in the system. It provides information for instructional adjustments and evaluation of student progress of learning in real or almost real time. Notice that the light green circle we use to represent formative assessment is in the center of all other assessment types. This is because formative assessment is the foundation for doing well on all other assessments in the system. Before we leave the slide, a quick word about diagnostic and placement tests. They are given as needed, and they diagnose strengths and weaknesses in students' existing knowledge and skills. They also are used to determine eligibility and placement of students in special programs. We realize that this is a rather complex topic. In the user's guide, we provide a definition, a copy of this diagram, and more elaboration on what each of these circles mean. Assessment is often synonymous with measurement, so it begs the question, how do we see and measure formative assessment? As school leaders, how will you observe, evaluate, analyze, and improve formative assessment practices? Our framework focuses on the observable instructional moves that teachers plan and enact. It isn't intended to be a complete representation of formative assessment, but it is a useful entry point for how to operationalize formative assessment practice. Our framework is divided into 4 major elements. First, establish high-quality learning goals, drawing from standards, learning progressions, and disciplinary practices. Learning goals are often referred to as learning objectives. Second, articulate success criteria to communicate clearly to students how they can achieve the learning goals. These are the observable behaviors of things students will be able to do that both teachers and students use in order to visualize and organize progress toward the learning goals. Third, plan to gather and analyze evidence about student progress toward learning goals. Every success criterion should have one opportunity for students to provide evidence of how they are doing in relation to that criterion. Teachers analyze that evidence both in the moment and immediately after the lesson. And fourth, plan to take pedagogical action in response to evidence of student progress. Both in the moment and immediately following the lesson, teachers respond to the evidence of student learning and progress. And of course, once learning goals are met, move on to new learning goals. Throughout the process, engage students as partners by integrating peer and self-assessment as a key component with the ultimate goal of promoting student agency and within a culture of collaboration. In the user's guide, we provide a copy of this diagram as well as a definition of each term. Learning goals state what students will learn in a lesson. Sometimes they are called learning objectives or targets, but they are not simply standards written on the board. They must be able to be achieved by the end of the lesson, and they should establish the context, purpose, and importance of that lesson. They must be written in a language that can be understood by students, whether those students are 5 or 15. And they are based on your state's college and career-ready standards, as well as your content area expectations and practices. Here's an example of a 3rd grade English language arts learning goal. In this lesson, students understand that readers and characters have backgrounds that affect how they react to problems in stories. As a literacy professional, the teacher should have some idea of how this goal fits into the year's scope and sequence, and this will affect how this goal is enacted in activities and classroom discourse. In this case, perhaps these 3rd grade students are just beginning to move beyond sharing their own personal reactions to events and stories and learning to see events from a character's points of view. You can see how this lesson will build in later grades as it becomes necessary to see multiple points of view within a complex narrative and will lead into analysis of characters' motivations. In other words, there's a lot of background information that goes into forming this learning goal, from the teacher's understanding of standards, the discipline, the classroom context, and the text that is being used. Success criteria are the observable activities of a lesson that describe what students say, do, make, or write. The most important aspect of this success criteria is that they align directly to the learning goal. And like learning goals, they must be written in a way that can be shared with students so that students can use them to guide their own learning. In our 3rd grade ELA example, The teacher will know that the student has achieved the learning goal when the student can identify how characters' reaction to the problem compared to the reader's, and the student can explain how characters' backgrounds might affect their feelings. There are many other ways that students might show their achievement of the learning goal. In this case, the teacher focused on these particular criteria because the text allowed the students to find instances of how the characters' backgrounds affected their feelings. As you can see here, the success criteria are visible. You can actually see students write, say, or do something to show that they know. Evidence gathering and analysis is the process of collecting information about student progress towards success criteria. That's a fancy way of saying, what are the activities that students do to show that they know? The purposes of this process are to provide feedback to the students and to help teachers adjust their instruction. When planning evidence gathering opportunities, it's important to vary participant structures so that students can show what they know in whole class, small group, and individual settings. This is also where you plan to include peer and self-assessment opportunities. Going back to our third graders, they're going to make a T-chart in their readers' notebooks to compare the characters' reactions and their own to certain situations in the text. They will also discuss in small groups how characters' responses differ from their own, using evidence. As you can see, this is what most teachers consider formative assessment. But it is, in fact, only the strategies and structures that facilitate collection of formative information. So while this is a part of the formative assessment process, it's just that, only a part. Once you set learning goals and success criteria and collect evidence of students' progress, it's necessary to take pedagogical action. In order to do so, it requires some pre-planning and knowledge of the content. Before teachers even begin the lesson, they predict where students may struggle. This may be in the form of misconceptions, procedural errors, or gaps in student knowledge, and language or communication challenges, or a mismatch of content or level. In other words, perhaps the topic is just not engaging to students, or it's too hard or too easy. Once teachers have these considerations in mind, they plan how they will provide support. This may be thinking about how to provide feedback, what they may model, explain, prompt, question, or simply tell. So, if our third graders identify their feelings using a single word, which a teacher might predict of her students, then she should be prepared to model elaboration and to provide prompts for students to encourage each other. And it may be that our third grade students get a little wrapped up in telling their own personal stories rather than sticking to textual evidence. In this case, the teacher might again provide gentle modeling for how students can remind each other to use textual evidence. So this is the last slide for the content for Learning Goal 1, understanding what formative assessment is. The next recording will continue with Learning Goal 2.